Hi, good evening, everybody. This is Antavia Paredes-Beaulieu with Climate Generation at COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. I was, kind of racking my brain thinking about what I wanted to share about my time this week, and I was thinking a lot about, how frustrated and how frustrating watching negotiations and sessions move forward has been. And I know that there's been a lot of people talking about how, upsetting it can be, kind of feeling like negotiations are kind of filled with false solutions, false promises. And a lot of people are talking about, like, what is the point of COP at this point? And I realized, the scientist in me likes receipts, and so I thought that it might be beneficial for you all to hear a very explicit example of where some of this frustration is coming from when you're here every day, especially, when we're talking about the differential between the global north and the global south. So today I attended a phenomenal session looking at the state of peatlands and wetlands, and looking at the science behind how beneficial supporting natural wetlands is for climate mitigation, and then also looking at the differential between how much of our natural wetlands are actually protected, and that's a separate conversation, right? But something that COP does really well actually is providing a platform for field experts, researchers, scientists, indigenous folks, people who have their boots on the ground and who are science informed, making presentations available and giving a platform for making science-informed decisions on behalf of policymakers and decision makers. And so, for example, today, I was sitting there listening to these phenomenal scientists break down the state of wetlands in our globe right now, looking at mitigation factors, for using them for carbon sequestration, as well as looking at some of their methane production and the importance of them, especially when you see industry or private land or natural wetlands being turned into croplands, you end up with land loss, and when you add in rising sea levels, you end up with a lot of erosion issues. But anyway, so looking at some of those projections are a little bit scary. And so for example, right after the experts were having their conversations with the public and answering comprehensive questions, from very interested scientists who are looking for clarification and wanting some more details, that's when the ministers and directors from different countries enter the picture. And it's interesting to note that the officials who are there representing the global south were there for the 4 different scientists giving their recommendations on the ways in which governments can move forward for protecting their natural wetlands. And they were present for the Q&A. They themselves asked some really interesting questions. And then it came time for the policymakers to take the stage and engage in conversation. And it was really awkward because the representatives from the global north hadn't even arrived yet. They weren't there for the conversation with the career experts in the first place, right? So they're not coming from a science-informed background that we know of. They weren't there for the Q&A, so they weren't able to have their own personal questions clarified by the experts in the space. And also it's just a general courtesy. They weren't on time. We all kind of awkwardly waited for them to arrive, and then a number of them arrived with in their own little posse using a separate door. It just felt very pretentious, honestly. And then it's interesting to note too that they essentially, read off of a piece of paper that was pre-prepared for them. There wasn't any quantifiable frameworks that they mentioned, no plans that were concrete. It was more like an acknowledgement that wetlands are important, and that so-and-so government is planning on doing what they can to protect them, right? But something that career politicians tend to do very well is say a lot of things that might be meaningful, might feel meaningful, but there's no facts in them. There's no actionables. There's no deliverables. They're not actually promising anything. They're simply repeating what the intent is behind the work, right? So they're saying that, let's say Germany believes that it's important to protect our natural wetlands because the science shows us that it's a great tool for managing a healthy ecosystem and keeping greenhouse gases in check. However, saying that doesn't change the fact that Germany has actually lost about 90% of their natural wetlands due to private industry and crops. And so there's no plan was presented, right, to discuss any mitigation factors. Least of all, like having a conversation about how you're going to do that equitably, right? And so it was a stark juxtaposition when representatives from the Global South were giving their take on it and what their government plans to do. They're in there with presentations, right? They're giving numbers and they're talking about work that they've already done for the past 10 years and what that impact has been looking like. Malaysia, for example, gave a wonderful discussion where they actually quantified the financial contribution that the government is planning and has in the past already put towards Indigenous folks who are actually doing the work, the everyday work to restore the wetlands and re-wet the lands. And in addition, they also broke down their government structure for everybody so that they could explain, the way in which the state rights have certain powers and how the work that they plan on doing in the future can be done within that framework, right? So investing in localized state programs to protect wetlands in that area. And that's something that I don't necessarily know how each government framework works. And so things like that are very valuable, right? And the other thing too is the representatives from the Global North didn't even stay and hear what the rest of the government officials had to say that their government was planning on doing, right? So there isn't even any transnational conversation happening. There's no learning. There's no accountability because afterwards there's always a platform for community to ask questions, looking for clarification, and maybe learning a little bit more, maybe teaching a little bit. And the representatives from the Global North had somewhere else to be. They all rushed out, right? So they're not learning, and they're not contributing, and they're not actually saying very much. And so this is just one example from tonight to kind of show how the frustration is palatable here. When it comes to observers trying to make sense of how these global policies are being dictated. There's all this talk about how this is the finance COP, and conversations about where money's coming from and who's going to have a piece of that pie. and what regulations are going to be put in place to make sure that these things are actually occurring. And so my big concern is the fact that, the people who are mobilized the most, the people who are showing actionable steps, that they've thought about it, that they've actually been implementing some of these processes for the last 5-10 years with positive results. The fact that they're showing up and they're listening and they're taking in experts' opinions, they're moving forward from a science-informed place, and they not only have the intention of following through with these things, they've already begun the work. They've already rolled up their sleeves, and so it breaks my heart thinking, the fact that the folks in this world who are most greatly impacted and who have created the least amount of climate crisis, contributed the least, those are the folks who are doing the work right now. And the folks who are coming from countries that honestly have the biggest bill on their backs, coming from places where they have the biggest contribution to the climate crisis globally, they're just reading off a piece of paper, saying what people want to hear, and they're not really discussing. They're not learning, they're not hearing, and they're just leaving because they got another meeting to go to, right? So that's where the frustration is, and honestly, COP's almost over. What are we even doing here at this point? So I don't know, when the biggest players aren't willing to sit down at the table, what's the point?